Hello, everyone, and happy Friday. Welcome to the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance's Crypto Roundup for August 11th, 2023. I am Ron Quaranta of the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance with my co-hosts David Brill and Josh Klayman. David, Josh, good to see you both. Before we begin, our usual disclaimer for everyone in the audience. And again, thank you all for joining. Nothing discussed is accounting, investment, legal, or tax advice. For those of you in the audience watching, if you do have questions, please hit us up in the chat. We'll try to answer them during the call. If we can't, we'll certainly answer them separately. David, Josh, another week, another list of things we wanted to talk about, and there's still more stuff that we want to add to the list. Josh, let's start with you. I want to kick it off if we could. We started with, hey, the SEC might appeal the Ripple ruling. And by the time you and I and David got through our talking points and reviewed them, they had put forward an interlocutory appeal or filing for that. Why is that important, and what the heck does that mean to the everyday person?
So what it basically means, with the caveats as usual that I am not a litigator, is that rather than waiting until the final resolution of the trial, right? Because certain of the decisions with respect to the motions for summary judgment, they were set to go to trial, right? The aiding and abetting claims and stuff like that. So rather than waiting for a full resolution, the SEC is requesting permission to appeal the decisions of Judge Torres in the middle of the case. And this is important because it has, no pun intended, but it's probably overused, potential ripple, implications for many other cases. And they actually are cited in the SEC's letter, what these other cases are. And so I think what the SEC has argued, and for those who haven't seen it, David Brill had a very masterful and compelling LinkedIn post where he discussed this, I think on Wednesday night, right when it came out. Not losing a moment. But where they say, look, there's already an intra-district split, right? And also saying these are compelling legal issues because these issues were decided as a matter of law. So I won't go into too much right now. I'll give David a chance to talk a little bit about it, but maybe we can bat things back and forth about this.
Yeah, go for it.
So yes, coming from New York this week, which is much cooler than Florida, which has been literally almost 100 every day in the high 90s. But look, I think this makes sense by the SEC. They clearly don't like Judge Torres's ruling. And I think they're just taking a strategy of using every opportunity they can to appeal the ruling. So they asked for certification for interlocutory appeal. If they don't get it from Judge Torres, then they'll appeal it at the end of the case. So I think it makes perfect sense from their perspective, and I would expect a really pitched battle between the SEC and Ripple arguing why or why not, and until the certification should be granted. So,
David, if I remember reading correctly, Ripple can respond to that appeal, correct? And I guess the follow-on for that, for those who aren't lawyers, is what might Judge Torres do? How might she respond to this appeal?
Well, I mean, I think she'll read, obviously, what the commission puts in front of them and what Ripple puts in front of her, and then determine, what the standards are, for certification and whether it meets it. She may take the view that she hasn't created a new law because she just is reflecting on Howey and using that as precedent and interpreting Howey with the facts of the Ripple case. And so she could very meaningfully say, I don't think this is right for cert, and that there hasn't been any new law formed here. I'm just doing an interpretation of the law for the Ripple case and the facts in the Ripple Labs case. So I think it's very interesting. Like if I was in the SEC shoes, I would do the same thing. They have nothing to lose here. And even if they don't win on this certification, they still have at the end of the case to bring it. The one thing I think is important, though, that I don't think people are talking about as much as, so if the Ripple case doesn't start the second part of the case till Q2 of 2024, and then the trial is goes through the whole process, you may not get a decision from Judge Torres till late 2024, maybe even early 2025. We just had that little thing of an election coming up in 2024. So, the whole political landscape could change by the time this ruling could potentially be appealed. You could have the Republicans take the Senate, You theoretically could have a Republican as president. So, there's a lot of political landscape that could move in this period of time too.
Yep. Josh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say some of the other things that the SEC pointed to include judicial efficiency, right? They raised the specter of potentially 2 trials, right? A trial, because I guess some of the questions in the Ripple litigation were stayed or were put off that will have to be answered in connection with the aiding and abetting trial, and potentially saying, hey, look, if we appeal this all at the end, we could end up right back having a second trial after the outcome. What's interesting to me, and I guess this is to be expected that they would appeal the entire ruling, right? But I think a lot of the focus had been on this programmatic sales. But
Right.
they also do, go into things about the other distributions as well, including citing, for example, to library and saying, look, in library, these types of payments to employees were deemed to be sales of investment contracts. And so I think it was quite expansive. I do think this is another example, though, of where we have so many overlaps, and that's what's making this space. I mean, I hate to say it this way, exciting. I'm sure it's not exciting for those involved in the litigation, right? But where this letter itself, in the Ripple case, cites to the trading platforms heavily citing to the Ripple decision,
Right.
and so it's like a tapestry and really something that is a living, breathing organism almost. What I would say also is that interestingly, when they talk about what they refer to as Ripple's ODL sales, which are the programmatic sales, they emphasize in italics, I think, if I go back and check, that Ripple has sold $3 billion via ODL sales. Yeah, $3 billion, and it is italicized in net sales. And so they said the court held that, well, actually, those are the on-demand liquidity transactions. So that there was a holding that those violated Section 5. But they talk about these ODL sales, and the SEC says, if Ripple intends to invoke Morrison with respect to monetary relief for its ODL sales, basically contesting jurisdiction, that could be, substantial, could take years, etc. So, yeah, there's a lot there.
Before we move forward, I just want to point out one of the benefits of us working together is WSBA swag, which it's always good to see.
Yeah.
Josh, if I could stick with you for 1 second, and I'm going to go a little off script here, but one of the feedback points that we've gotten off of the past couple of broadcasts that the three of us have done is a lot of folks don't understand the difference between the Rakoff decision and submission and Judge Torres. And I don't want us to be too legal a conversation. I know there's a lot for us to cover, but can one of you explain for dummies like me what the differences between those cases are? Because what's been brought forth by the judges isn't exactly apples to apples.
That's right. Do you want me to?
Go ahead, Josh. Yeah.
You can start.
Sure. So in its most basic terms, other than the fact that, as David noted, the Ripple decision is on the facts of Ripple, right?
Right.
So of course, what's alleged in the SEC v. Terraform Labs Do Kwon case, different facts, right? Certainly different scenario or different alleged scenario. But there's also a procedural difference in where we are in the case. So we have to remember that the Ripple decision was decided based on dual motions for summary judgment, one submitted by the SEC, one submitted by the defendants, where this case has been ongoing for years now. A lot of discovery has happened. So, for example, the Hinman emails come out and various other types of facts or alleged facts. And, one could say, okay, well, Judge Torres looked at the facts and what had been presented and argued in the motions for summary judgment and said there's no issue of material fact here, right? And so that's why they were decided as a matter of law. They didn't need to go to trial because the SEC, at least on certain points, had not met its burden. And by contrast, on certain other points, the defendants, Judge Torres determined, had not met their burden. Now, with Judge Rakoff, it's a different posture, right? It's based on a motion to dismiss. So part of that, in the most basic explanation, possible is that, it's basically on the pleadings, right? And basically, if you take the facts as alleged by the SEC in the best light to the SEC, do they state a claim, right?
Right.
Such that it can go forward. And so it's possible that at the stage at which at the summary judgment stage later on, maybe there will be a judgment as a matter of law that goes either in favor of the SEC or the other way, or is split.
Right.
We just don't know yet. So it's a much earlier stance.
Right. Thank you, Josh. David, go ahead.
No, I agree, and Josh says it well, and that is a big difference. I mean, I don't think people were surprised that Judge Rakoff didn't, grant Terraform's motion, because like Josh said, based on the pleadings, there's enough there to have to make a determination later on during the proceedings. And also, I do have to pick up that, this does feel like a legal soap opera that's going on between all the different parts. And, one thing that came to me is I had a feeling of like The Empire Strikes Back with the appeal by the SEC against Ripple. And I'm sure there are plenty of memes that will go around about that. But it does have that feeling. And it really is like a real legal drama in a way because of all the interconnected pieces.
Yeah, and the importance of that drama is something, and again, as a non-lawyer, I try to look at that from that outside perspective that I think is really important. One other tangent to that, and I don't want to make it a too much again of a court conversation, but I think some of the things that people focus on are the differences in the judges themselves. And one of the things a colleague mentioned to me was that he was sort of surprised, and I'm going to use the phrase by the tone and tempo of Judge Rakoff's perspective on Judge Torres's rendering. Why is that relevant? I mean, everyone's got different personalities. Some judges have different focuses and perspectives. And I think I would argue that some colleagues in the industry spent a bit too much time on that. But was anyone surprised by how Judge Rakoff framed the Judge Torres's decision or commentary?
I mean, I thought I was a little surprised. Usually there's a decorum between judges, especially in the same district.
Yeah.
And, look, obviously, there's so many disagreements on district court levels, and that's the whole reason why we have an appellate court system, that appeals for different reasons are made, and sometimes there's two different rulings in a district, sometimes it's a district court case that's appealed. But Judge Rakoff did seem to be pretty dismissive of Judge Torres's reasoning in the case. I think one thing we also can't forget, and I made this distinction in my LinkedIn post, is that Terraform and Do Kwon are viewed as a fraud. Ripple has a real purposeful business. And so the lens that you might look at a fraudulent case being put before you versus a case of a company that has a legitimate business, and it's a matter of how you interpret the law, really frames things a little bit. And also, as I understand, Judge Rakoff, is a very law and order type judge and worked at the SEC for many years. And so I think where he might be more deferential to a government entity, Judge Torres might have been more down the middle.
Do we still have the concern? Go ahead, Josh. I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just going to say, and also, just as David notes about, basically the facts or the alleged facts in Terraform and Do Kwon, Judge Rakoff, in addition to being, as I understand it, a titan of the securities bar, right? I'm very experienced with those types of cases. He was also the judge before whom Charlie Shrem pled guilty in Silk Road and who sentenced him to jail. So, when you think about what might color one's view, I mean, Silk Road, alleged fraud, we can imagine.
Yeah, and I think there are some unfair perspectives on a little bit of this as well with deference to these judges, which is, and I don't know Judge Torres, but reading about Judge Rakoff, he's an older gentleman, as you both mentioned. I'm not sure how deeply he understands the products or capabilities, but he's knowledgeable enough to really look at through the lens of his experience and render some perspectives on this that are probably important.
What I think also will be, and I agree with you, Ron, I think also will be interesting is if you look at the Coinbase motion for judgment on the pleadings, one of the places where they disagree with Judge Rakoff relates to the idea of a scheme, right? And what constitutes a scheme. And saying that, look, even citing Black's Law Dictionary saying a scheme is a document, right? However, it's just interesting. It will be just as there was a pretty explicit, I don't want to call it attack by Judge Rakoff on Judge Torres, but, very pointed statements. I think, it's possible that we may see similar statements depending on how the court rules on Coinbase's motion for judgment on the pleadings.
Josh, it reminds me of our most recent legal working group, and I made the foolish question that I put in front of the group was, can someone describe or define what a scheme means in this context? And with 50 lawyers, 50 pairs of eyes just simultaneously rolled. And I had hit the question that so many people want to focus on. I just want to pivot a little bit if we could. The other big news, and I was completely blown away by this, PayPal launched a stablecoin, and a lot of people in the crypto space said, yay. And then like clockwork, some of the talking heads, and I mean that with as much respect as I can garner, in Washington had come out and said, well, we're really, really, really disturbed by this because there's no federal regulatory framework for stablecoins. This coming from the body that would put forward a federal regulatory framework for stablecoins. Did you both get that perspective, or am I overreading? What were your thoughts about the announcements?
The irony of it all, I guess, for starters.
Yep.
Look, PayPal's put forward their stablecoin protocol. It's going to be backed by, I believe, dollars 1-for-1. Yep. I think they've taken some lessons from other failed projects. I think the thing that people forget is innovation continues to move on. Even though we have this sort of deadlock in Congress, in this, sort of somewhat of a judicial deadlock right now in our judiciary, innovation moves on. And if it's not going to be here, it's going to be somewhere else. And so I'm not involved with the PayPal project in any way, but it doesn't surprise me that, a deep-pocketed company stepped into the breach.
Okay, Josh.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think it's a positive sign. Certainly, the fact that big names are still coming forward and putting this just shows to me that, as I believe we all think, crypto has legs, and digital assets are the future, irrespective of, whatever kinds of judicial rulings are being decided. I think crypto will live on. It's interesting to me, though, as I understand it, PayPal partnered with Paxos, right? So instead of now it's PUSD, right? And it's just interesting because we saw the SEC have or rather, we saw an enforcement action. I can't remember exactly who. I believe it could have been the SEC, but I haven't double checked, against BUSD, right? Or someone causing Paxos not to support BUSD with Binance before. So it's interesting to think about what could be the differences here, and how. Certainly, I don't have inside information on this, but it would be really interesting to understand how PayPal got comfortable, how the parties distinguish this. So I think that's definitely one to watch. I do think, Ron, to your point, as it was rumored, I believe, I don't want to call it more than a rumor, but I believe there were some tweets about it where certain legislators had blamed the Biden administration for the federal stablecoin bill not going forward. It could be that that saying, look, how could this happen without us having the federal stablecoin bill, is a way of pushing back, right? And saying, look, we need this because innovation, to your point, doesn't stop.
Right. Can I throw out one question there? The conspiracy theory of the week that I've been chatting with some friends about, and I'm not generally a big conspiracy theorist, was when you look at PayPal, I think people really lose sight of the fact that PayPal has been involved in some way with crypto for some time. And they've got a pretty deep bench of really smart people, both from a regulatory and legal perspective, as well as a technology perspective as well. When you look at the size of a PayPal network, is this a politician's fear of having greater access for crypto to a wider audience, and that's what's driving these comments? Or are we overreading that kind of conspiracy theory, David?
I think it's a step further. I think stable coins, we've talked about this before.
Yep.
I've certainly said this to the two of you, but there's this national security issue. The more prevalent stable coins are, the less the ability of our government has to use our currency as sort of a foreign policy tool. Yeah. So I think, you get this very kind of interesting group together of people who are probably, defense hawks who don't want to undermine America's ability to use our monetary policy as a sword. And then you get, people on the other side of the aisle who've just been anti-crypto and just continue to be anti-crypto, on and on. And so, you can see those two groups kind of coming together.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we have to, the one thing I would just add is that, like, we as a country have to make peace with the fact that this is going to happen. Like, it would be better if we got ahead of it and sort of maybe had more of a role in it. But this is going to happen, and it's just not an if question, it's a when question.
David, the eternal optimist. Josh, weigh in.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the big things with this is not just PayPal, but Venmo, right? Which belongs to PayPal. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I end up using Venmo and Cash App pretty regularly, much more so than I personally use PayPal. So I do think it could be a little bit of that, of course, with the national security concerns and other concerns, systemic risk and the like. I mean, this is definitely something where the average person, I would say, uses Venmo, right? I would imagine. And so I think that is really, to me, one of the compelling points.
It'll be interesting to see where it goes. Do you suspect that PayPal will be called down to hearings on the Hill? And I know, Josh, you and I were not joking about it, but talking about this is probably going to be fodder for our policy updates that we're going to be starting next month as well. But you've got to imagine Congress, or at least some folks in Congress, will call PayPal down to the Hill to discuss it. Am I wrong?
Oh, I'm sure Maxine Waters will be sending some note or saying something, and that seems to be in her playbook. Look, they can call them down. I'm sure that between Paxos and PayPal, they've looked at the regulatory landscape. They've been thoughtful about it, and I'm sure they'll have answers to the questions.
Guys, I'm going to rip up the script again if I could, and I only saw the article late last night or early this morning. The time is starting to blur. I want to go back to the SEC vis-a-vis ETFs. So Kathy Wood, who used to be on our board back in the day, in the early days, Josh, as you and I recall, she has her organization, ARK Investment, has a proposed ETF that was just delayed a bit by the SEC for open commentary. And her public comments, I believe, is on Bloomberg. Shout out to Kathy. Was that her perspective is the SEC may approve a bunch of them simultaneously. So A, what are your perspectives on that? And B, I guess the question ultimately becomes, is this a regulator on its back foot trying to help the industry move forward? Where does this go?
I don't know if it's...
I told you I was ripping up the script, David. I'm sorry.
I would say that I do think an ETF next year is inevitable. My view is that the SEC will take the full 240 days in the process before enabling one to go forward. And I do think it would be equitable that a number of ETFs were approved at the same time. I mean, it wouldn't, typically it usually went by the first filing, in order of time, but it feels like a number of them will be approved simultaneously. Look, I worked on one of the first ETF filings in 2016. And, at that time, while it didn't seem likely it would get approved, we're 7 years later. And, so look, I do think it'll happen. And I do think it's going to be a very big point in the crypto ecosystem when it does happen. But remember, there are ETFs in other countries already, Bitcoin ETFs, and they're functioning properly. So again, I think, unfortunately, we're just a little behind the curve here in the US.
Does it feel like 100 years ago, David?
Crypto years, or 1 year in crypto is like 7 years in real life. So
it is. Josh, go ahead. I'm sorry. I interrupted.
No, you didn't interrupt. I was just hesitating and sort of finding my way in. I mean, I do think, thinking more broadly, certainly if there are arguments saying, look, the SEC is overreaching, the SEC is trying to make crypto illegal in the US and prevent it. If someone takes that position with respect to, say, the major questions doctrine, right, and expands it like that, then I could see potentially reasons for which the SEC might say, okay, let's let these ETFs go through, right? Just to show that there is some forward progress, just like with, for example, Prometheum, right? Or those types of things where the SEC, some have criticized the SEC for having certain projects that were able to go forward.
Yeah.
I do think it likely is getting, I would imagine, harder and harder to have the justification to resist the ETFs, particularly as they pop up everywhere
Particularly with the depth of conversation you've got to imagine they're having with BlackRock, for example. A BlackRock does not, willy-nilly put in an ETF application for something like BTC. So it makes you wonder whether or not their perspective is shifting a bit. David, go ahead.
I also don't forget that Grayscale has its lawsuit against the SEC about
Exactly.
converting their trust into an ETF. So, their hand may be forced, depending on the ruling in that case in the DC circuit. So, and also remember, look, everybody agrees now that Bitcoin's a commodity, and as a commodity, other commodities have ETFs, and I think some of the arguments against having a Bitcoin ETF have sort of eroded over time as the markets have matured. So I think there's this confluence of things coming together, and it feels like to me, next year we will see it next year.
Yeah, and look, in my opinion, to be perfectly candid, I would suggest that the SEC 5, 6, 7 years ago had some concerns about things like data transparency and market manipulation. I think, David, to your point, the maturity of the market and the tools that are enabled now in that market really aid that discussion. Go ahead, Josh.
I was just going to say, because I'm noticing our time and it's running a bit short. There was something else that I thought was worth mentioning. I'm sure you guys have other things as well. But that was the settlement that was announced by Bittrex and its former CEO, where it was announced just yesterday that they agreed to settle charges that they operated an unregistered national securities exchange, broker, and clearing agency. And the foreign affiliate of Bittrex Global GmbH, also agreed to settle charges that it had failed to register as a national securities exchange. So it's really interesting. I believe that there was a total monetary payment of $24 million that was agreed to. I think it says, I'm looking at it right now, disgorgement of $14.4 million, prejudgment interest of $4 million, and a civil penalty of $5.6 million. Now, some have pointed out that I believe the U.S. Bittrex entity is in bankruptcy, and I wonder whether that may have motivated some of the settlement. But I also note, they haven't admitted liability.
Yep.
I also, it struck me, and perhaps it wouldn't if I were a litigator, right? But it did strike me that the settlement amount, relative to how much I would imagine certain players in the space, and certainly from Ripple, we had heard a figure, I believe it was something like 200 million, right, in legal fees so far. It's a striking difference. And
Josh, we'll have to get some of our litigator friends in the legal working group to show up as a guest. I feel we can go
absolutely
pretty deep on this. I want to move on to a couple of things, and I know, David, I'm going to go tech analyst on you. You and I haven't had a chance to speak about this, but you and I literally shared, I think, the same thought at the same time in our Slack channel. And the headline for me that I read, and I think it was at The Block, shout out to the guys at The Block, altcoin inverse head and shoulders pattern has emerged, which is obviously bullish. David, I remember the tech analysis days where we'd be charting and no one made sense about anything. What are we talking about, and do you buy into this?
So in super layman terms, and we're short of time, it's just sort of a pattern where there are different areas where the altcoin market cap has landed. And these areas typically denote a trend. And the trend that they're talking about is that it would be bullish for the altcoin market if the altcoin market reached a certain valuation, because it would have created a trend that typically leads to a rapid rise in valuation of the overall altcoin market, which is all the tokens besides Bitcoin and Ethereum. So net, it looks like a positive formation is in progress, but I'm still a little skeptical about seeing a rally in altcoins. I mean, I do think a lot of them are priced very cheaply. I think there's a lot of good token projects that are inexpensive based on where they've been at one time in this cycle. But I still think it's too early for that to come around.
and you can imagine that some of that speculation is put forward. There's the kind of X conversation, formerly known as Twitter, on, Doge potentially being part of this kind of Internet of Everything. You see some of the technical stuff, David, around Shibarium and an Ether bridge for Shiba.
Yeah.
Again, for the folks in the audience, none of this is investment advice. I joke about Shiba, but please don't take me seriously. So it'll be interesting to see where this goes. Josh, go ahead. You wanted to weigh in.
So this will show my ignorance about trading in general, or the realities of it. But is inverse head and shoulders, is that a real thing outside of the crypto space?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Oh,
Okay.
yeah.
All right,
So
I was
a
like,
head and shoulders chart, when you map price and volume for classic equities, David, correct me if I'm wrong, is generally bearish. And inverse head and shoulders, based on price and volume moves, is considered to be bullish.
Yes.
and knees and toes? Knees and toes?
No, we haven't gotten to knees and toes, but if you want to have a technical analysis conversation, it gets wacky.
Yes. Well, basically, Josh, a lot of the technical analysis that they do in equities have been overlaid into crypto, and some of the traditional patterns apply in crypto.
That makes sense to me. I just didn't know if it was like a
No,
real
it's,
term.
That
it's
was
a
not a
real-
dumb question
it's
at
a
all.
real term, and books have been written about it. And
Oh, yeah.
we're really tapping back into my equity research days when
Graham's investment analysis would poo-poo this entire conversation,
Yes.
as you know, David.
But it's another data point to look at, and it's
Yeah.
helpful to when you look at the market to see. One of the things with technical analysis, like you see where the market stops in certain places, and you wonder why it stops in those places. And a lot of it goes to technical analysis of things that you've seen in other markets. So it's a very interesting and deep process, but it does give you clues, even if you're sort of standing outside of it.
It does. And the other, in all seriousness, David, there's a lot of focus on technical analysis from some colleagues I know in the space, simply because the basics of fundamental analysis for things in crypto is not particularly well set. You can't fundamentally analyze a crypto, and this is old conversations, the way you would fundamentally analyze an equity and a revenue stream, for example.
What I would say, Ron, is it's a different kind of analysis.
Agreed.
So instead of like earnings per share, like one of the things you might want to look at is like, well, how many new wallets own this token?
Yep.
Or how much activity is going on that blockchain?
Yep.
And those are some signs to give you a sense of, what's happening and where the momentum may be or where the building is going on.
Yep.
But the signs are much different than the signs you would look at, in the Wall Street Journal back in the day.
Yeah, and that fundamental analysis, Josh, to kick it over to the legal space, for some folks, it's who's on their legal team, how engaged are they with lawyers, which is some of the quote-unquote fundamental analysis some folks do. I know we're a little bit out of time. What are you both looking forward to next week? And then I have a prediction question for both of you.
Okay. You go first, Josh. What's on your mind for next week?
At this point, I'm just really looking expectantly at what we might hear next week, either in terms of enforcement or responses or something like that. I don't have any events lined up that I'm aware of, but I am, like you said at the beginning, Ron and David, every day is a new chapter,
Yeah.
and possibly a new book.
Yep.
So,
David, what about you, buddy?
I'm curious to see, what else comes out of the Ripple case, and also, like Josh said, as the world turns, who knows what you wake up to the following day. But I think it's really interesting that we're in the middle of August, which typically would be a quiet month, whether you're in legal practice or in financial services. But in crypto, it's truly 24/7, and it's truly every day you wake up to something new and interesting going on.
I sometimes miss those quiet days, David, but I wouldn't miss what we're all working to accomplish here. I'm actually going to be policy wonking on both of you. I'm going to be reading some of the Federal Reserve commentary on novel banking activities and kind of deep diving into some of that. I suspect we should touch on it sometime next week. So here's my prediction question for both of you.
Okay.
And this is totally out of left field, but Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg, who wins? I had to do it, David. I had to ask.
Oh, I don't even have a
You're not even entertaining this.
I'm not even. I thought you were going to ask, like, will Elon Musk pick a token to be the X.com token? That's where I thought you were going. I really don't have a view. I think I'd be more focused on football season coming up than that cage match.
Josh, you're not getting away without answering.
I mean, Zuck is looking kind of fit. So
Yes, he is looking ripped. I heard a news broadcaster say. I don't want to be interested in this, but I find the spectacle of it fascinating. But other than that, you're both amazing. As always, it's always a great conversation. We'll leave it there. Thank you all to the audience who joined us. If we didn't get around to any questions or you want to follow up with us, please do email us info@wsba.co. I'm also going to shamelessly plug David and Josh, our WSBA crypto industry principals. We recently recorded on LinkedIn Live our episode 4 that very specifically looked at custody and segregation of assets. That'll also be on our YouTube channel. But we'll leave it there. David, Josh, always a privilege. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thanks.
sounds great.
Bye-bye, everyone.